It's a new year and it's a new YouTube channel. Welcome to the first ever episode of the Oaktree Sports Network. I'm your host, Bart Eichenbohm, and let's get right into things with this week's NFL recap. In a week full of matches with serious playoff implications and several clinching scenarios, we started off in Cleveland, with the Browns taking on the Jets on Thursday Night Football. Joe Flacco had one of his cleanest games yet as he continues to perform at the highest level, throwing for over 300 yards again with 3 touchdowns to just 1 interception. He got a crucial win to clinch the playoffs from the Browns and looked a little bored doing so, yawning on the sideline, eager for more competition in the playoffs. It is incredible what this Browns team has been able to accomplish. We have all probably heard the incredible stats about this team, including the fact that they're the first team to make the playoffs with at least 4 starting quarterbacks. But hey, against all odds, they are a year in the playoffs, and it looks like they will be taking on the winner of the AFC South. We now move on to one of the few Saturday Night Football games of the season, in what is one of the most important games in the NFC for playoff seeding. If the Lions win, they would still have a shot at the number 1 seed in the NFC. The Cowboys, on the other hand, would still have the slimmest of chances at the NFC East title. However, this would require the Eagles to lose to either the Giants or the Cardinals, and that would never happen. Anyway, the Cowboys were yet to be defeated at home, and the Lions sought to change this. Dak played a great game, throwing for over 340 yards, and led the Cowboys to a fourth quarter comeback to take a 7-point lead with a late field goal. However, the Lions would drive right back down the field to score a touchdown with just 23 seconds remaining. At this point, the true MVPs for the Cowboys would make themselves known though. In what will go down as one of the worst calls in NFL history, the officiating crew got the lineman reporting as eligible wrong, nullifying the successful 2-point conversion by the Lions. They then went for it again and again, but failed to convert, and so the Cowboys retained their home winning streak, albeit with an asterisk going forward. With the Cowboys winning yet again, the pressure was now on the Eagles, who still controlled their own destiny, but needed to beat the Cardinals to remain kings of the NFC East. The Eagles didn't play great, but had a commanding 21-6 point lead at halftime, so surely nothing could possibly go wrong for the Eagles at this point. Unless...
Pressure coming, end zone, Wilson, touchdown!
Maybe this Eagle is just a falcon in disguise, but at least the Eagles retook the lead with a field goal with just over 2 minutes left to go. However, the Cardinals would soar right down the field again and prove that they truly had
A fire in your gut?
to beat the Eagles and force the Eagles into a road playoff game. The Cardinals winning also delighted one of their NFC West rivals, as the Eagles losing locked the 49ers into the number 1 seed after they knocked off the Commanders. More on this game later on. Whew! Following all that excitement from these playoff games, let's take a breather with a game lacking any playoff implications. Or at least real playoff implications. The Bears still had a chance to reach the playoffs on paper, but as the Falcons came in, the Bears fans in attendance were probably more concerned with Carolina possibly locking up their first overall draft pick against the struggling Jaguars team than a result of their own game today. Fields played a great game, and the Chicago faithful let him know that they are fully behind him as the Bears beat the Falcons quite convincingly. Let's move on to the battle for the NFC South crown. The Bucs would lock this up with a win, while the Saints were looking to play spoiler and move into the lead of the NFC South next week if things went their way. The Bucs had looked great over the last couple of weeks, but didn't look as good this week as Baker threw 2 interceptions, allowing the Saints to come out on top. The Bucs hold the tiebreaker and so still control their own destiny, but the Saints will be hoping that Bryce Young and the Panthers could pull off the upset next week against the Bucs. Speaking of Bryce Young, he looked great in last week's game against the Packers, and so Panthers fans were hoping that they could keep this momentum going into this week's game with the Jaguars, who have been struggling of late. However, just a couple of hours later, the Panthers owner was throwing drinks at Jags supporters, so yeah, safe to say that did not happen. The Panthers were shut out in Jacksonville as CJ Beathard led his team to victory and keeping the hopes of the Jags alive to win the AFC South as the three-way tie atop the division continues. Another CJ also aimed to lead his AFC South team to victory to keep a historically downbeaten franchise in the playoff hunt and AFC South division race. Rookie of the Year candidate CJ Stroud returned in the Texans matchup against the Titans this week.
The prodigal, my son returns.
He did not have one of his signature performances, but played pretty mistake-free football to lead his team to a convincing win. The Texans defense also stepped up in this one to keep the Titans to just 3 points. The Texans will face the Colts in primetime next week to see who will make the playoffs. And possibly, if the Titans knock off the Jags, who will win the AFC South. Speaking of the Colts, they faced a hot Raiders team this week, off the back of 2 impressive AFC West wins. Although the Colts won by just 3, this one never really felt close. With the Colts already being up 14-3 at halftime, Minshew and O'Connell both had a solid game. But there is not too much else to say about this one. On to next week for the Colts. Now, continuing with all the playoff excitement, onto the battle between 2 premier teams of the AFC, the freely scoring Dolphins finally coming off a win against an opponent over 500, against the Ravens, who cemented themselves as the best team in the NFL for many, following their showcase against the Niners last week. After the first quarter, it did indeed look like we were in for quite a battle, as it ended 10-7 with the Dolphins ahead. However, the Ravens then switched it up a gear and went into halftime with a 28-13 lead. Lamar ended up with 5 touchdowns, solidifying his place in the MVP conversation. And even Tyler Huntley cut in on the scoring, throwing for a touchdown of his own as he came in for Lamar when the game was already decided. This Ravens team is truly something different, as they have proven over the last 2 weeks, knocking off the best competition that both the AFC and the NFC have to offer in convincing fashion. That Dolphins loss has given us one of the most intriguing situations for a team coming into Week 18. That team is from their own conference, in the Bills. The Bills first took on the Patriots in one of the sloppiest games of the season. The game ended with 5 total turnovers, 4 of which were on the Patriots side, and almost all of these came in the first quarter. Yet the Bills failed to take full advantage of this and kept the Patriots in the game right till the very end. The Bills did come out on top finally, setting up this exciting possibility for Week 18. If the Bills win against the Dolphins, they will win the AFC East, and the Dolphins end up in a wildcard spot. But on the other hand, if the Bills lose, they could still lose out on the playoffs altogether. Could we see another upset involving an NFC East and an NFC West team? The Giants were hoping to do just that as they faced the Rams on Sunday. These teams played each other hard in a closely contested game. The scoring went back and forth between the two teams, and with just 3 minutes and 27 left to play, the Giants returned a punt to the house to make it a 1-point game after a failed 2-point conversion. Although they had nothing left to play for, the Giants were determined to get this win for their fans, and they would get the ball back with enough time to get into field goal range. Time for recently signed kicker Mason Crosby to earn his next contract by hitting the game winner with time expiring, and...
Good snap, good hold, Crosby's kick is no good!
Oh no. Well, instead, the Rams lock up their playoff spot in this one, and we'll be looking forward to their game with the 49ers next week to get ready for the playoffs. As mentioned, the 49ers are set to be the number 1 seed in the NFC following their win over the Commanders this week, as well as the surprising loss by the Eagles against the Cardinals. Brock Purdy looked much more like his usual self this week, playing some efficient football, throwing for 2 touchdowns and just 6 incompletions on 28 attempts. The Commanders started Sam Howell again this week, as Brissett was unable to play, and after flashes he showed early this season, he does not look like the long-term answer at quarterback for the Commanders, throwing another 2 interceptions against the Niners this week. Despite their struggles against the Ravens last week, the 49ers still very much look like the team to beat in the NFC as we head into the playoffs. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry to report that the ride in Denver is finally over. Russ got benched and the Broncos will be looking to move on from him going into the next season. This week, Jarrett Stidham got the start for the Broncos, facing a Chargers team still without Herbert, but also still without Staley. However, maybe the Peyton system will slowly turn any quarterback into the Russell Wilson we've seen over the past season, as Stidham had nearly identical stat line as Wilson earlier this month against the Chargers. So for old time's sake, one last time, Broncos country, let's ride. Despite their win, the Broncos were officially eliminated from playoff contention though, given the result of the final game involving an AFC West team. Like the Broncos, the Chiefs also went up against a team missing their franchise quarterback picked in the 2020 draft. However, unlike the Chargers, the Bengals do still have something to play up for themselves, as they're still hopeful to get into the AFC playoffs. The Chiefs face the Bengals led by Browning, and where this may have been an intriguing matchup a couple of weeks ago, given the Chiefs' struggles and Browning's impressive start, the Browning magic arguably ran out last week. Despite not really making any major mistakes, Browning's completion percentage was way down compared to his first couple of starts, and the Chiefs survived this one. But the Bengals probably will feel like they could have gotten more out of this one, as they failed to score in the second half, and so 4 Chiefs field goals in the second half ended up being just enough to sneak out with a win. Just 2 games remain this week, and both involve teams fighting for the final playoff spot in the NFC. The first of these was in Seattle, where the Seahawks faced the Steelers, who still have playoff hopes of their own. Mason Rudolph did not have the magical performance he had last week ahead of Christmas, but played a solid game and did enough for his Steelers to sneak out of Seattle with a win, to keep their playoff hopes alive, as well as guaranteeing Mike Tomlin another season of over 500 football with his Steelers. Meanwhile, Seahawks fans are condemned to being sleepless in Seattle for the next week, as they will hope that their team will make the playoffs. But there was one other team that had something to say about this. Minnesota can finally rejoice as Kirk Cousins returned to the delight of Vikings fans everywhere. Sadly for them though, he was still not playing, but instead returned for the pre-game festivities for their matchup with the rival Packers. So, the Vikings were still stuck with Jaron Hall at quarterback? But hey, he's facing a Joe Barry defense, so what could possibly go wrong? He will probably end up looking like the next Tom Brady or Peyton Manning this week. Sadly for Vikings fans, this did in fact not happen, as the Packers defense finally stepped up, and Hall was benched at halftime for Mullins. The Vikings were held to just 10 points, while Jordan Love proved once and for all that he is the future for the Packers at quarterback, throwing 3 touchdowns in this one. The Packers won in convincing fashion and controlled their own destiny once again. This is really starting to feel like a rerun of last year, doesn't it? Where an NFC North rival can knock the Packers out of the playoffs in a head-to-head game, in a final game of the season, all in the favor of the Seahawks? Seems a little too similar to me. Anyway, that's all for this week. Come back next week for the final NFL recap of this year's NFL regular season.